April 7th, 1945, 12:20 hours, East China Sea, 200 miles southwest of Kyushu. Admiral Seiichi Ito stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful warship ever constructed, watching the horizon for signs of the American carrier aircraft he knew were coming. The Yamato displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded, more than any battleship in history. Her 9 18.1-inch guns could hurl 3,200-pound shells over 26 miles. Her armor plating was up to 26 inches thick, designed to withstand anything the enemy could deliver. Yet Admiral Ito knew, with absolute certainty, that his magnificent ship was sailing on a suicide mission. Operation Ten-Go, Heaven No. 1, was not a battle plan but an execution order. The Yamato had been given fuel for a one-way voyage to Okinawa, where she was to beach herself and fight as a stationary fortress until destroyed. There would be no return. There would be no victory. There would only be a dramatic death that the Imperial Japanese Navy hoped would inspire the nation to continue fighting. What made this suicide mission particularly bitter was that Ito understood exactly how the Yamato would die. Not in glorious battleship-to-battleship combat, the kind of naval warfare Japanese doctrine had been built around for half a century. Not even against American battleships, which at least would have been honorable defeat by equivalent weapons. The Yamato would be destroyed by aircraft, small, relatively fragile machines that Japanese naval strategists had dismissed as secondary weapons compared to the mighty battleship's guns. The supreme irony was that Japan herself had proven at Pearl Harbor that aircraft carriers had made battleships obsolete. Yet Japanese leadership had never truly internalized this lesson, continuing to believe that massive guns and thick armor represented ultimate naval power. Within 3 hours, Admiral Ito would be dead, killed when a bomb penetrated the Yamato's bridge. Within 4 hours, the Yamato would be on the bottom of the East China Sea, sunk not by battleship guns, but by bombs and torpedoes delivered by aircraft, the toys that Japanese naval doctrine had consistently underestimated throughout the war. The destruction of the Yamato would represent the final, irrevocable proof that an era of naval warfare had ended, killed by weapons that the architects of battleship supremacy had never taken seriously enough. The battleship Yamato had been conceived in the late 1930s as the ultimate expression of Japanese naval power. Naval architects had designed her specifically to overcome American numerical superiority. If the United States could build more battleships, Japan would build better battleships, ships so powerful that one Japanese battleship could defeat 2 or 3 American equivalents. The Yamato and her sister ship Musashi represented this philosophy at its apex. The specifications were extraordinary. The main battery of 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship, could engage targets beyond the range of any American battleship. The armor scheme was designed to withstand 18-inch shells at battle ranges. The fire control systems were among the most sophisticated in the world. The ship was designed to be unsinkable, incorporating multiple redundancies, extensive compartmentalization, and damage control systems that theoretically could sustain massive battle damage. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who commanded the combined fleet when the Yamato was commissioned in December 1941, understood the ship's strategic limitations, even as he admired her engineering. Yamamoto had spent years in the United States and understood American industrial capacity. He knew that Japan could never win a war of attrition against American shipbuilding. More significantly, Yamamoto had become convinced that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would determine naval supremacy in the Pacific. This conviction led Yamamoto to plan and execute the Pearl Harbor attack using carrier-based aircraft, a raid that demonstrated conclusively that battleships were vulnerable to air attack. 6 American battleships were sunk or heavily damaged by Japanese carrier planes on December 7, 1941. The attack proved that the era of battleship supremacy was ending. Aircraft could deliver devastating strikes against surface vessels that had no effective defense against aerial assault. Yet even as Japanese carrier aircraft were proving this reality at Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval leadership continued building and deploying battleships. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. Japan had demonstrated that carriers were more strategically valuable than battleships, yet continued to invest resources in battleship construction and continued to structure fleet doctrine around battleship engagement. This contradiction reflected a deeper cultural and institutional attachment to battleship warfare. The battleship represented traditional naval power, massive guns, thick armor, and the prospect of decisive surface engagements, where superior gunnery and tactics determined victory. Aircraft carriers, by contrast, represented a newer, less familiar form of warfare, where the decisive weapons were fragile aircraft operating far from the ship that launched them. Japanese naval officers trained in battleship tactics found it psychologically difficult to accept that the weapons they had mastered were being rendered obsolete by weapons they had never fully respected. The Yamato's war record illustrated this obsolescence. Despite being the most powerful battleship ever built, she engaged enemy surface vessels only once, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when she fired her main battery at American escort carriers at extreme range, achieving minimal results. Most of her combat service involved being attacked by American aircraft, while contributing little offensive capability. She was too valuable to risk, too expensive to lose, and ultimately too irrelevant to matter. By April 1945, the strategic situation was desperate. American forces had captured Iwo Jima and invaded Okinawa. B-29 bombers were systematically destroying Japanese cities. The combined fleet had been shattered at Leyte Gulf. Japan possessed insufficient fuel for sustained naval operations. The Yamato represented one of the last major surface units remaining, but she had nowhere to go and nothing meaningful to accomplish. Operation Tengo emerged from this strategic desperation. Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka proposed sending the Yamato on a one-way mission to Okinawa. The ship would beach herself on the island and use her massive guns as shore batteries, supporting Japanese ground forces. When her ammunition was exhausted, the crew would abandon ship and fight as infantry. It was a suicide mission that would waste Japan's most powerful warship in a gesture that military analysts knew would accomplish nothing significant. Admiral Ito, selected to command this final voyage, protested the operation. He understood that sending the Yamato without air cover or support vessels was condemning 3,300 men to death for no military purpose. But orders were orders. The operation was approved at the highest levels as a demonstration that the Navy was still fighting, still willing to sacrifice, still contributing to national defense, even as the war was clearly lost. If you're enjoying this incredible true story of the Yamato, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. There's plenty more hidden stories of World War II coming your way. The Yamato departed Tokuyama on April 6, 1945, accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. The force had been given only enough fuel for a one-way voyage, approximately 2,500 tons, when the Yamato normally carried 6,300 tons for full operations. This single detail communicated more clearly than any order that the mission was intended to end in the ship's destruction. American intelligence detected the Japanese force almost immediately. Submarines reported the Yamato's departure. Reconnaissance aircraft tracked the formation as it proceeded southwest toward Okinawa. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the U.S. Fifth Fleet, ordered Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 to intercept and destroy the Japanese force using carrier aircraft. The irony of the situation would have been apparent to any objective observer. The Yamato, designed to engage enemy battleships in surface combat, would be attacked by aircraft from carriers, the very type of warfare that Japan had pioneered at Pearl Harbor but never fully embraced strategically. The weapon that Japanese doctrine considered secondary would destroy the weapon Japanese doctrine considered supreme. On the morning of April 7th, American search planes located the Japanese force. Mitcher ordered strikes launched from multiple carrier groups. Over 380 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers were dispatched to attack the Yamato and her escorts. The attacking force outnumbered the total aircraft capacity of the entire Japanese surface force, which had zero air cover. The first American aircraft arrived over the Japanese formation at approximately 12:30 hours. Admiral Ito ordered the ships to increase speed and begin evasive maneuvers. The Yamato's anti-aircraft armament was formidable, more than 150 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers, but she was designed to resist surface attack, not sustained aerial assault from hundreds of aircraft attacking simultaneously. The American attacks were coordinated and relentless. Dive bombers attacked from high altitude, forcing the Yamato to maneuver to avoid bombs. While the ship was turning, torpedo bombers would attack from multiple directions simultaneously, a classic anvil attack that made evasion impossible. If the Yamato turned to avoid torpedoes from port, she exposed her starboard side to other torpedo bombers attacking from that direction. The first torpedo struck the Yamato's port side at approximately 12:40 hours. The explosion created flooding in several compartments, but the ship's extensive compartmentalization and damage control systems contained the damage. The Yamato continued maneuvering and fighting. Her anti-aircraft guns shot down several American aircraft, but the attacking waves continued. More torpedoes struck over the following hour. Each hit caused additional flooding, additional list, additional strain on damage control systems that were being overwhelmed by cumulative damage. The Yamato's designers had created redundant systems that could handle several torpedo hits, but they had not designed her to survive 10 or 12 torpedo hits, plus multiple bomb strikes, all delivered within an hour, which is exactly what the American carrier aircraft were inflicting. By 1400 hours, the Yamato had taken at least 10 torpedo hits and multiple bombs. Her list to port had reached approximately 15 degrees and was increasing. Flooding had overwhelmed pumping capacity. The ship was settling lower in the water. Counter-flooding measures to correct the list had failed to stabilize the ship. At approximately 14:05 hours, Admiral Ito realized the Yamato was beyond saving. With a heavy heart, he gave the order for the crew to abandon ship, knowing that many would not survive the chaotic descent into the ocean. Choosing to embrace his fate rather than live with the shame of defeat, he tied himself to the ship's compass, resolute in dying with his vessel. Captain Kosaku Aruga, the Yamato's commanding officer, shared the same grim determination, refusing to leave the deck. The final moments came at 14:23 hours. The Yamato's list had increased to over 30 degrees. Water was entering through damaged compartments faster than it could be controlled. Suddenly, a massive secondary explosion occurred, likely a bomb or torpedo hit that penetrated to one of the main magazines, detonating the stored ammunition. The explosion was catastrophic, tearing the ship apart and sending a mushroom cloud of smoke and debris thousands of feet into the air that was visible over 100 miles away. The Yamato capsized and sank in less than 2 minutes after the magazine explosion. Of the 3,332 crew members aboard, only 280 survived. Admiral Ito, Captain Aruga, and most of the crew were killed instantly, either by the explosion or by drowning as the ship sank. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 of the 8 destroyers were also sunk in the action. Total Japanese casualties exceeded 4,000 men. The Americans lost 10 aircraft, a remarkable exchange ratio that demonstrated how one-sided naval warfare had become when carriers engaged surface vessels without air cover. The carriers that launched the attacks were never within visual range of the Yamato. The battleship's magnificent guns, designed to destroy enemy battleships at ranges exceeding 20 miles, never fired a shot at an enemy surface vessel during this final action because there were no enemy surface vessels to shoot at. The sinking of the Yamato represented multiple ironies that Japanese naval leadership had never fully confronted. The battleship, designed as the ultimate weapon to ensure Japanese naval supremacy, had been rendered strategically irrelevant by weapons, aircraft carriers, and aircraft that Japanese strategists had consistently undervalued despite Japan's own success using those weapons at Pearl Harbor. Japanese naval doctrine throughout the 1930s and early 1940s had emphasized battleship warfare. The Yamato and Musashi were conceived as tools to overcome American numerical superiority through qualitative superiority. One Japanese super battleship would be worth 2 or 3 American battleships, but this calculation assumed that naval warfare would be decided by battleship versus battleship gunnery duels. When warfare shifted to carrier-based aircraft as the decisive weapons, the entire strategic framework collapsed. The particularly bitter irony was that Japan had pioneered carrier warfare. Admiral Yamamoto had demonstrated at Pearl Harbor that carriers could strike enemy battleships with devastating effect. Japanese carrier aircraft had sunk the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse off Malaya in December 1941, again proving that battleships without air cover were vulnerable to carrier strikes. Japan had proven the lesson, but never fully internalized it. This failure reflected institutional and cultural factors that made Japanese naval leadership resistant to fully embracing carrier-centric doctrine. The battleship represented traditional naval warfare, the kind of warfare Japanese officers had been trained for, had studied, had prepared their entire careers to execute. Aircraft carriers represented something newer, less familiar, less comfortable. Even after Pearl Harbor proved carrier supremacy, Japanese doctrine continued to treat carriers primarily as support for battleships, rather than as the primary strike weapons. The contrast with American naval doctrine was striking. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had no choice but to emphasize carriers. Most of their battleships were sunk or damaged in the attack. This forced adaptation accelerated American carrier doctrine development. By 1943 to 1944, the U.S. Navy had fully embraced carrier warfare as the primary naval strategy, with battleships relegated to supporting roles providing anti-aircraft protection and shore bombardment. Japan, despite pioneering carrier operations, never made this full transition. Resources continued to be allocated to battleship construction. Tactical doctrine continued to emphasize battleship engagement. Cultural prestige continued to attach to battleship command rather than carrier command. The result was strategic obsolescence, continuing to prepare for a type of warfare that technology had made irrelevant. The sinking of the Yamato was the final, undeniable proof of this obsolescence. The most powerful battleship ever built, incorporating the finest naval architecture and engineering Japan could achieve, had been destroyed in less than 2 hours by aircraft, relatively fragile machines that individually were far less powerful than the battleship they destroyed. The cumulative effect of many small attacks, coordinated and sustained, had overwhelmed defensive systems designed to resist a few massive attacks. This pattern, many small weapons overwhelming defenses designed for fewer large weapons, was characteristic of industrial warfare in World War II. The Germans had learned this lesson when Allied bombers destroyed their cities through cumulative attacks rather than single decisive raids. The Japanese were learning it as American submarines strangled their shipping through numerous individual sinkings rather than single major naval battles. And the Yamato demonstrated it in the naval context. Many aircraft delivering many bombs and torpedoes could destroy what single weapons could not. Japanese leadership's failure to fully understand this reality extended beyond just naval doctrine. There was a broader Japanese tendency to emphasize quality over quantity, to believe that superior individual weapons or warriors could overcome numerical inferiority. The Yamato embodied this philosophy, one super battleship worth multiple normal battleships. But industrial warfare favored quantity, sustainability, and the ability to absorb losses while maintaining operational capacity. American naval strategy embraced this industrial approach. The U.S. Navy built carriers rapidly. Essex-class fleet carriers were produced at rates that Japanese shipyards couldn't approach. American pilot training produced thousands of aviators, ensuring that aircraft losses could be sustained. American industrial capacity meant that lost aircraft could be replaced within weeks. The entire system was designed for sustained operations, assuming significant attrition. Japan's approach was opposite. The Yamato and Musashi represented enormous resource investments that couldn't be easily replaced. Japanese pilot training, especially after the disastrous losses at Midway and in the Solomons campaigns, couldn't replace experienced aviators quickly enough. Japanese industrial capacity couldn't sustain the losses inherent in industrial warfare. The result was a brittle system that, once damaged, couldn't recover. The Yamato's final voyage symbolized this systemic failure. The one-way mission with insufficient fuel represented an acknowledgement that Japan could no longer sustain normal naval operations. The lack of air cover represented the collapse of Japanese naval aviation. The suicidal nature of the mission represented the desperation of leadership that had no better options, and the ship's destruction by the very type of weapons that Japanese doctrine had consistently undervalued represented the culmination of strategic errors that had been evident since before the war began. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who survived the war, reflected on Yamato's loss. The sinking of the Yamato was not just the loss of a ship, it was the death of a philosophy. We believed battleships determined naval supremacy, but aircraft proved decisive. We knew it intellectually, yet never accepted it emotionally. Admiral Micha, whose carrier planes sank Yamato, added, "It was magnificent, but obsolete before it even sailed." Japan clung to battleships instead of embracing carriers, and paid the price. Japanese engineers had created small, expendable weapons like midget submarines and Kaiten torpedoes, but leadership favored massive battleships like Yamato. Ironically, it was toys, carrier aircraft and submarines, that sank her, proving Japan's obsession with giant ships obsolete. The Yamato's death highlighted the failure to adapt, showing that in modern war, perception, strategy, and small, clever weapons often mattered more than sheer size and firepower.